The interstate highways stretch like veins across the heart of America, winding through endless plains, dense forests, and desolate stretches of land. They are lifelines for truckers, those solitary figures who drive through the night, hauling goods from one end of the country to the other. But the road can be a strange and terrifying place. And there are tales whispered among truckers that would make even the bravest soul think twice before venturing out after dark. This is the story of one such trucker, a man named Dale Parker. Dale had been a trucker for nearly 20 years, and in that time he had seen it all: blizzards, tornadoes, and accidents that left him shaken for days. But nothing had ever truly scared him, until the night he drove through a remote stretch of highway in Montana. It was late October, and the weather had taken a turn for the worse. A cold front had swept through the region, bringing with it thick fog that clung to the ground like a living thing. Visibility was poor, and the road was slick with rain that had frozen into a thin layer of ice. Dale gripped the steering wheel tightly as he navigated the winding road, the headlights of his rig barely penetrating the dense fog. He had been driving for hours, and fatigue was beginning to set in. His eyes were heavy, and he fought to keep them open. The hum of the engine and the rhythmic thump of the tires on the asphalt were lulling him into a dangerous state of drowsiness. He needed to pull over and rest, but there were no rest stops in sight, just mile after mile of empty road. As he rounded a bend, something caught his eye, a figure standing on the side of the road. At first he thought it was a hitchhiker, but as he drew closer, he realized it was something else entirely. The figure was tall and thin, with long, spindly limbs that seemed to stretch unnaturally. Its skin was pale, almost translucent, and its eyes were large and black, like empty sockets. It wore tattered clothing that fluttered in the wind, and its mouth hung open in a silent scream. Dale's heart skipped a beat, and he slammed on the brakes, bringing the rig to a screeching halt. The figure didn't move, it just stood there, staring at him with those empty eyes. Dale's mind raced. Was it a person? An animal? Something else entirely? He reached for the radio to call for help, but his hand froze in midair when the figure suddenly disappeared. One moment it was there, and the next it was gone, swallowed by the fog. Dale blinked, trying to make sense of what he had just seen. Had it been a trick of the light? A hallucination brought on by fatigue? He shook his head, trying to clear his thoughts. He couldn't afford to lose his nerve out here, not when he was still miles from the nearest town. He put the rig in gear and continued down the road, but he couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. The fog seemed to thicken as he drove, the visibility dropping to almost nothing. The world outside the cab was a swirling mass of gray, and the only sound was the drumming of rain on the roof. Dale's nerves were frayed, and every shadow seemed to take on a life of its own. He kept glancing in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see that figure standing in the middle of the road, but there was nothing there. After what felt like an eternity, he saw a faint light in the distance, a gas station. Relief washed over him as he pulled off the highway and into the parking lot. The station was old and run down, the kind of place that hadn't seen a fresh coat of paint in decades. The neon sign flickered weakly, casting an eerie glow over the cracked pavement. Dale parked the rig and climbed out, his legs stiff from hours of driving. The cold air bit into his skin, and he pulled his jacket tighter around him as he made his way to the entrance. The door creaked loudly as he pushed it open, and a bell jingled somewhere in the back. The interior of the gas station was dimly lit, the shelves sparsely stocked with dusty cans of food and outdated magazines. An old man sat behind the counter, his weathered face barely visible under the brim of a stained cowboy hat. He looked up as Dale entered, his eyes narrowing. "Evening," Dale said, trying to sound casual. The old man grunted in response, his gaze lingering on Dale for a moment longer than necessary. Dale felt a chill run down his spine. There was something off about the man, something that set his nerves on edge. "I need to use the restroom," Dale said, his voice betraying his unease. The old man nodded toward the back of the store. "Through there. Be quick about it." Dale nodded and made his way to the restroom, the floorboards creaking under his boots. The restroom was small and dirty, with a flickering fluorescent light that cast harsh shadows on the peeling wallpaper. He splashed some water on his face, hoping to wake himself up, but the cold water did little to shake the sense of dread that had settled over him. As he stood there, staring at his reflection in the cracked mirror, he heard a faint sound, a whisper, just on the edge of hearing. He turned around, but there was no one there. The restroom was empty, the door closed, but the whispering continued, growing louder and more insistent, until it was all he could hear. Dale backed away from the mirror, his heart pounding in his chest. The whispers seemed to be coming from the walls, from the very air around him. He fumbled for the door handle and yanked it open, stumbling out into the hallway. The gas station was eerily silent, the old man no longer behind the counter. The only sound was the faint hum of the fluorescent lights overhead. Dale hurried to the front of the store, but the old man was nowhere to be seen. The door to the outside was wide open, the fog rolling in like a living thing. Dale stepped outside, the cold air biting at his skin. His truck was still parked where he had left it, but something was wrong, very wrong. The fog seemed to swirl around the rig, almost as if it were alive. And standing next to it was the figure he had seen on the side of the road, its empty eyes fixed on him. Dale's breath caught in his throat, and he froze in place. The figure began to move toward him, its limbs bending and contorting in unnatural ways. It made no sound, but Dale could feel its presence, like a weight pressing down on him. He turned and ran, his boots slipping on the wet pavement as he sprinted toward the truck. He could hear the figure behind him, its movements growing faster, more frantic. He reached the door of the cab and yanked it open, throwing himself inside and slamming the door shut behind him. The figure was right there, just outside the window, its face pressed against the glass. Dale could see the empty sockets where its eyes should have been, the gaping mouth that seemed to stretch impossibly wide. It raised one hand and pressed it against the window, the glass fogging up under its touch. Dale fumbled for the keys and jammed them into the ignition. The engine roared to life, and he slammed his foot on the gas, the tires screeching as they struggled to gain traction on the icy pavement. The rig lurched forward, and the figure was gone, swallowed by the fog once again. Dale didn't stop driving until he reached the next town, hours later. He pulled into a well-lit truck stop and parked, his hands shaking as he shut off the engine. He sat there for a long time, his heart still racing, trying to make sense of what had happened. But there was no making sense of it. What he had seen, what he had experienced, defied all logic. The road had played a cruel trick on him, or perhaps it had shown him something that was never meant to be seen. Dale never drove through that stretch of highway again. He took a different route, one that added hours to his trip, but he didn't care. He knew that whatever was out there in the fog, on that lonely road in Montana, was something far beyond his understanding. And he wasn't the only one. Other truckers told similar stories, of strange figures on the side of the road, of whispers in the night, of things that should not exist. The road is a dangerous place, they say, and there are things out there that would make even the most seasoned trucker think twice before driving alone in the dark. Dale Parker learned that lesson the hard way, and he would never forget it. The road had taken a piece of him that night, and he knew it would never give it back. Dale Parker's resolve to avoid that cursed stretch of highway was strong, but the road has a way of calling those who fear it most. A few months passed, and the memory of that night in Montana began to fade, replaced by the routine of long hauls, roadside diners, and the monotony of endless miles. But some memories never truly disappear, they linger, waiting for the right moment to resurface. It was late January when Dale found himself in a bind. A heavy snowstorm had hit the Midwest, closing down several major routes. Dispatch, desperate to keep deliveries on schedule, called in a favor. The only available path to get his load to Seattle on time was through Montana down that same stretch of highway he had vowed never to see again. Dale argued, protested even, but the dispatcher was insistent. "You're the only one who can do it, Dale. You're our best driver. And you know the route. It's just the weather playing tricks on you last time, right? Nothing to be scared of." He wanted to say no, to refuse the job and risk losing it all. But the road was his life. It was all he knew. Dale reluctantly agreed, though his gut twisted with unease as he set off once more into the cold, unforgiving night. The first leg of the journey was uneventful. The snowstorm had made the roads treacherous, but Dale's years of experience guided him safely through. He kept the radio off, preferring the sound of the engine and the whine of the wind as it whipped across the snow-covered plains. The further he drove, the more the dread in his stomach grew, a dark cloud gathering on the horizon of his mind. It was well after midnight when he finally reached the edge of the highway he had sworn never to drive again. The road was covered in a thick layer of snow, untouched by any other vehicles. The trees lining the road stood like silent sentinels, their branches weighed down with ice, forming a canopy that blocked out the moonlight. Dale slowed the rig, his hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly that his knuckles turned white. The fog began to creep in, swirling around the truck like smoke, just as it had that fateful night. His breath hitched, but he forced himself to keep driving. There was no turning back now. The miles dragged by, each one feeling longer than the last. The fog thickened, reducing visibility to just a few feet in front of the truck. Dale leaned forward, squinting at the road, trying to see through the dense mist. His heart pounded in his chest, every nerve in his body on edge, waiting for something, anything, to jump out at him from the fog. And then, it happened. The figure appeared, just as it had before, standing in the middle of the road. This time, there was no mistaking it for a trick of the light or a figment of his imagination. The thing was real, and it was staring right at him. Dale slammed on the brakes, the truck skidding on the icy road. The figure didn't move, didn't flinch. It just stood there, its hollow eyes locked onto Dale's. He couldn't breathe, he couldn't think. All he could do was stare back at the figure, paralyzed by fear. His mind screamed at him to move, to get out of there, but his body refused to obey. It was as if the figure had some kind of hold on him, freezing him in place with its gaze. The figure began to move, slowly at first, then faster, as if it were gliding across the snow-covered ground. Dale's heart raced as it approached the truck, its long, spindly arms reaching out toward the cab. In a panic, Dale reached for the gear shift, slamming the truck into reverse. The tires spun, struggling to gain traction on the icy road, but he managed to back away from the figure. It followed, its movements jerky and unnatural, like a marionette controlled by invisible strings. Dale's breath came in ragged gasps as he fumbled for the CB radio, desperate to call for help. But the radio was dead, the static replaced by an eerie, high-pitched whine that sent shivers down his spine. He threw it down in frustration, his eyes darting between the figure and the road behind him. The figure was almost at the driver's side door now, its face, if it could be called that, mere inches from the glass. Dale could see its skin, pale and mottled, stretched taut over a skull-like face. Its mouth was still open in that silent scream, but this time, he could hear something. A low, guttural growl that seemed to vibrate through the very air around him. The growl grew louder, more insistent, until it was all Dale could hear. He slammed his hands over his ears trying to block it out, but it was no use. The sound filled his head, pounding against his skull like a jackhammer. In a blind panic, Dale floored the accelerator, the truck lurching backward at a dangerous speed. The figure was thrown back by the force of the truck's movement, disappearing into the fog as Dale swerved wildly to avoid it. The rig careened off the road, crashing through the underbrush and into the trees. The impact was jarring, throwing Dale against the steering wheel and knocking the breath out of him. The world spun, and for a moment everything went black. When he came to, the truck was still, its engine idling softly. Dale groaned, his body aching from the crash. He sat up, wincing as he touched the spot on his head where it had hit the steering wheel. Blood trickled down his forehead, but he ignored it, his mind still reeling from what had just happened. He glanced out the window, expecting to see the figure standing there, waiting for him. But there was nothing, just the fog, swirling lazily around the truck. The figure was gone, as if it had never been there at all. Dale let out a shaky breath, his hands trembling as he wiped the blood from his face. He needed to get out of here, to get back on the road and away from this place as fast as possible. But the truck was stuck, its wheels buried in the snow and mud. He fumbled for his phone, praying for a signal. But there was none. He was stranded, alone in the middle of nowhere, with no way to call for help. The growl started again, faint at first, then growing louder, more insistent. Dale's heart raced as he realized it was coming from the woods, from somewhere deep within the trees. He had to move. He had to get out of there. Dale scrambled out of the cab, slipping on the ice as he hit the ground. The cold air stung his lungs as he gasped for breath, his mind racing with panic. He could still hear the growl, growing closer, louder. Without thinking, Dale ran. He didn't know where he was going, didn't care. He just needed to get away from that thing, whatever it was. His boots crunched through the snow, his breath coming in ragged gasps as he sprinted through the trees. But the growl followed him, relentless, unyielding. It was closer now, so close that he could feel it vibrating through the ground beneath his feet. Dale ran faster, pushing his body to its limits, but it was no use. The growl was right behind him, a low, menacing sound that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, the growl stopped. Dale skidded to a halt, his heart pounding in his chest. He turned around, searching the darkness for any sign of the figure. But there was nothing. The woods were silent, the fog hanging low around the trees. For a moment, Dale dared to hope that it was over, that he had somehow escaped. But then, out of the corner of his eye, he saw movement, a shadow, flitting between the trees. The figure emerged from the fog, its movement slow and deliberate. It didn't glide this time, it walked, its long, spindly limbs moving in a grotesque parody of a human gait. Its face was still twisted into that horrible silent scream, its empty eyes locked onto Dale's. He took a step back, his breath hitching in his throat. The figure continued to advance, its movements jerky and unnatural. Dale's mind screamed at him to run, but his legs refused to move. He was rooted to the spot, paralyzed by fear. The figure reached out, its bony fingers inches from Dale's face. He could feel the cold emanating from it, a chill that seeped into his bones, freezing him from the inside out. And then, just as it was about to touch him, it stopped. The figure stood there, its hand outstretched, its empty eyes staring into Dale's. For a moment, time seemed to freeze, the world around them suspended in a silent, nightmarish tableau. Then, without warning, the figure vanished, dissolving into the fog like smoke. Dale collapsed to the ground, his body shaking uncontrollably. He gasped for breath, his mind struggling to comprehend what had just happened. He was alive, but he knew, deep down, that he would never be the same. The road had claimed another piece of him that night, a piece that he would never get back. He had stared into the abyss, and the abyss had stared back, leaving him hollowed out, a shell of the man he once was. Dale Parker never drove again after that night. He gave up trucking, abandoning the life he had known for so long. The road had taken too much from him, and he had nothing left to give. But even in the quiet of his new life, far from the highways and the endless miles, the memories haunted him. The growl, the figure, the fog, They were always there, lurking at the edges of his mind, waiting for the right moment to re-emerge. And in the darkest hours of the night, when sleep eluded him, Dale could still hear that low, menacing growl, echoing through the silence, reminding him that the road never truly lets you go. Dale Parker tried to rebuild his life away from the highway, but the scars of his encounters were too deep. The nightmares came frequently now. Always the same. The fog, the growl, the figure with hollow eyes. He would wake up drenched in sweat, the echoes of that terrible night reverberating in his mind. Despite his best efforts to leave the world of trucking behind, the road had become a part of him, a dark, twisted part that refused to let go. He found work at a small auto repair shop in his hometown, trying to stay busy, trying to distract himself from the memories. But every time he heard the roar of a passing semi, his heart would skip a beat, and for a split second, he would be back on that lonely highway, staring into the void. His co-workers noticed the change in him. Dale had always been a quiet man, but now he was withdrawn, distant. They respected his privacy, though the whispered rumors about his past spread through the shop like wildfire. Some said he had seen something on the road, something that had driven him to the edge of madness. Others believed it was the stress of years on the highway that had finally broken him. Dale never talked about what happened, not even when the nightmares grew too strong to bear. He tried everything. Therapy, medication, even long walks through the quiet streets of his town in the dead of night, hoping the cool air would clear his mind. But nothing worked. The memories were always there, lurking just beneath the surface, waiting to drag him back into the darkness. And then one day, the nightmares took a turn for the worse. It started subtly, with small things out of place, tools moved when no one was around, the feeling of being watched even when he was alone in his apartment. Dale dismissed it at first, blaming it on his frayed nerves, but deep down, he knew something was wrong. The growl that haunted his dreams began to bleed into his waking hours, a low rumble that seemed to emanate from the very walls of his home. He started hearing it everywhere, the growl in the distance, growing louder with each passing day. It was as if the road had followed him, seeping into his life like a dark, insidious presence. Dale began to lose sleep, his mind unraveling under the weight of the constant fear. He knew he was being hunted, but by what? And why now? One evening, after another sleepless night, Dale received an unexpected visit. It was nearly dusk when he heard a knock at the door. He wasn't expecting anyone, and his heart quickened as he approached the door. When he opened it, he found a man standing on his doorstep, dressed in a faded trucker's jacket and a worn baseball cap. "Dale Parker?" the man asked, his voice rough and gravelly. Dale nodded, eyeing the stranger warily. There was something familiar about the man, something that made Dale's skin crawl. "Name's Hank," the man said, holding out a hand. "Heard you used to be a trucker." "I was too. Got out a few years back, but the road never really leaves you, does it?" Dale hesitated before shaking the man's hand, his mind racing. There was something off about this Hank, something that set Dale on edge. "What do you want?" Dale asked, his voice strained. Hank glanced around as if making sure they were alone, then leaned in closer. "I know what you've seen, Dale. I've seen it too. The figure, the fog, the growl. It's real, and it's coming for you." Dale's blood ran cold. He tried to pull away, but Hank's grip tightened. "You think you can outrun it? You think leaving the road will save you? It won't. It's part of you now, just like it's part of me. And once it's got its hooks in you, it never lets go." Dale's heart pounded in his chest as he stared at the man in disbelief. "How do you know?" he whispered. Hank released Dale's hand and stepped back, his expression grim. "Because I've been running for years, and it's finally caught up to me. I can hear it every night, getting closer, just like you do. It's hungry, Dale. It's hungry for us." Dale felt a wave of nausea wash over him. "What does it want?" he asked, his voice trembling. Hank's eyes darkened, and for a moment, Dale saw something in them, something terrifyingly familiar. It feeds on fear, on pain, on the souls of those who've seen it. The road is its hunting ground, and we're the prey. There's no escaping it, Dale. The only thing you can do is face it." Dale shook his head, backing away from the door. "No, I'm done with that life. I'm not going back." Hank's expression softened, a look of pity crossing his face. "You don't have a choice, Dale. None of us do. It's coming, and when it does, you'll wish you'd been prepared." Dale slammed the door in Hank's face, his hands shaking. He locked it and backed away, his mind reeling from the encounter. Hank's words echoed in his ears, fueling the growing dread that had taken root in his soul. That night, Dale barely slept. Every time he closed his eyes, he heard the growl louder than before, as if it were right outside his window. When he did manage to drift off, his dreams were filled with the figure, its hollow eyes staring into his, its hand reaching out to drag him back into the darkness. When he awoke, drenched in sweat and shaking, he knew he couldn't stay there any longer. The growl was real, the figure was real. He couldn't run from it anymore. Dale packed a bag, grabbed his keys, and headed out into the night. The cold air bit at his skin as he climbed into his old pickup truck. his breath fogging up the windshield. He didn't know where he was going, only that he had to get away from the house, away from the town, away from everything. He drove for hours, the empty road stretching out before him like a lifeline. The growl followed him, growing louder the further he drove. The headlights barely cut through the thickening fog, and Dale's hands gripped the steering wheel with white-knuckled intensity. He kept driving until the gas gauge dipped into the red, forcing him to pull into a deserted rest stop somewhere in the middle of nowhere. The place was eerily quiet, the fog swirling around the truck as he killed the engine and stepped out into the cold night air. Dale looked around, his breath visible in the frigid air. The rest stop was old, the buildings dilapidated, and the parking lot cracked and overgrown with weeds. The only light came from a flickering street lamp, casting long shadows that danced on the ground. He felt a presence, something watching him from the shadows. His heart pounded in his chest as he turned, scanning the darkness for any sign of movement. The growl was there, just on the edge of hearing, low and menacing. Dale's eyes locked onto a figure standing at the edge of the parking lot, barely visible through the fog. It was the same as before, tall, thin, with long, spindly limbs and hollow, empty eyes. But this time, it wasn't alone. More figures emerged from the fog surrounding the parking lot. Each one was identical, their faces twisted into the same silent scream, their eyes fixed on Dale. They moved in unison, their bodies jerking and twitching as they closed in on him. Dale backed up against the truck, his heart racing. There was nowhere to run, nowhere to hide. The figures advanced, their growls growing louder, a chorus of malevolent voices that reverberated through the night. As they drew closer, Dale felt a cold hand wrap around his wrist, pulling him toward the darkness. He struggled, but the grip was like iron, unyielding and relentless. The figures loomed over him, their empty eyes boring into his soul. Dale screamed, a primal, desperate sound that echoed through the empty rest stop. But there was no one to hear, no one to save him. The last thing he saw before the darkness swallowed him whole was the figure's hand, reaching out to touch his face, its cold fingers brushing against his skin. And then, everything went black. Dale Parker's truck was found abandoned at the rest stop a few days later, the keys still in the ignition. There was no sign of Dale, no clues as to what had happened to him. The authorities conducted a search but found nothing, no footprints, no evidence, nothing at all. The case was eventually closed, labeled a missing persons case with no leads, but the truckers who passed through that rest stop knew better. They whispered among themselves about Dale, about the figures in the fog, about the growl that haunted the highways. They knew that the road had claimed another victim, another soul lost to the darkness that lurked just beyond the edge of the headlights. And they knew that one day it might come for them too. For the road is a hungry thing, a living entity that feeds on the fear and pain of those who dare to travel it. And once it has its hooks in you, there is no escape. No matter how far you run, no matter how fast you drive, the road will always find you in the end. The story of Dale Parker spread like wildfire among truckers, shared in hushed tones at truck stops and rest areas. It became a cautionary tale, a ghost story told by the grizzled veterans of the road to the younger drivers, just starting their careers. Some dismissed it as a myth, a tale concocted to scare rookies, while others nodded solemnly, knowing that the road held many secrets, dark secrets that only those who had been out there long enough could understand. But the story didn't end with Dale Parker. As the years passed, more and more truckers reported seeing strange things on that lonely stretch of highway in Montana. The sightings varied. Some saw figures in the fog, others heard the eerie growl that haunted Dale's nightmares, and a few even claimed to have encountered the hollow-eyed specter itself. One such trucker was Jesse McNeil, a seasoned driver with over 20 years of experience under his belt. Jesse had heard the stories about Dale, but he didn't believe in ghosts. He was a practical man, grounded in reality, and he knew the road was full of hazards, but ghosts weren't one of them. That all changed on a stormy night in late February. Jesse was hauling a load of timber from Oregon to Minnesota, a long and grueling trip, made worse by the heavy snow that had blanketed the northern states. The weather reports had warned of blizzards, but Jesse had a schedule to keep, and he wasn't about to let a little snow slow him down. As he crossed into Montana, the snow intensified, thick flakes swirling in the wind and reducing visibility to near zero. The road was slick with ice, and Jesse had to fight to keep the rig on the highway. He kept his eyes on the road, his hands steady on the wheel, his mind focused on the task at hand. But as the night wore on, a sense of unease began to creep in. The snowstorm seemed to have a life of its own, the wind howling like a wounded animal, the snow blinding him at every turn. Jesse felt like he was driving through a nightmare, the world outside his cab distorted and strange. And then, just past midnight, the fog rolled in. It came out of nowhere, thick and suffocating, enveloping the truck in an instant. Jesse slowed the rig to a crawl, peering through the windshield in a desperate attempt to see the road ahead. The fog was so dense that his headlights barely cut through it, casting an eerie, diffused glow over the landscape. That's when he saw it. At first it was just a shadow, a dark shape in the middle of the road. Jesse squinted, trying to make sense of what he was seeing. The shape grew clearer as he approached, resolving into the figure of a man standing in the center of the highway. Jesse's heart skipped a beat. He slammed on the brakes, the rig skidding on the ice as it came to a stop just a few feet from the figure. The man didn't move, didn't flinch, just stood there, staring at Jesse with hollow, empty eyes. The stories of Dale Parker flashed through Jesse's mind, but he shook them off. This was no ghost, he told himself. Just some poor soul lost in the storm. He grabbed his flashlight and climbed out of the cab, the wind and snow whipping at his face as he made his way toward the figure. "Hey!" Jesse called out, his voice barely audible over the howling wind. "You okay? You need help?" The figure didn't respond, didn't move. Jesse felt a chill run down his spine, but he pushed it aside and continued forward. As he got closer, he noticed that the man was wearing a trucker's jacket, old and faded, with a worn baseball cap pulled low over his eyes. "Hey buddy, you can't just stand in the middle of the road like that, it's dangerous," Jesse shouted, his nerves starting to fray. Still no response. Jesse was only a few feet away now, and he could see the man's face clearly, or rather, what was left of it. The skin was pale and mottled, stretched taut over a gaunt, skull-like face. The eyes were empty, dark holes that seemed to swallow the light from Jesse's flashlight. Jesse froze, his breath catching in his throat. The figure was wrong, unnatural, a grotesque parody of a human being. The stories were true. Dale Parker hadn't been imagining things. This thing, this monster, was real. Before Jesse could react, the figure's head snapped up, its hollow eyes locking onto his. A low, guttural growl emanated from its chest, a sound that seemed to vibrate through the air, through Jesse's very bones. The flashlight slipped from Jesse's hand, clattering to the ground. He backed away, his heart pounding in his chest, but the figure followed, its movements jerky and unnatural, like a puppet on strings. Jesse turned and ran, slipping and sliding on the icy road as he scrambled back to the truck. He could hear the growl growing louder, closer, the figure right behind him. Panic surged through him as he fumbled with the door handle, his fingers numb from the cold and fear. He finally managed to yank the door open and throw himself into the cab, slamming the door shut just as the figure reached the side of the truck. Jesse locked the doors and scrambled into the driver's seat, his hands shaking as he tried to start the engine. The truck roared to life, and Jesse floored the accelerator, the tires spinning on the ice before finally gaining traction. The rig lurched forward, and Jesse risked a glance in the side mirror. The figure was still there, standing in the middle of the road, watching him with those empty, hollow eyes. The growl was still in his ears, a low, menacing sound that seemed to follow him as he sped away into the night. Jesse drove for hours, not daring to stop until he was well out of Montana, the snowstorm finally beginning to let up. When he finally pulled into a truck stop in North Dakota, he was shaking so badly that he could barely park the rig. He stumbled into the diner, his face pale, his eyes wide with fear. The other truckers gave him strange looks as he sat down at the counter, his hands trembling as he reached for the cup of coffee the waitress placed in front of him. "Rough night?" she asked, her voice soft with concern. Jesse nodded, his mind still reeling from what he had seen. He wanted to tell her, to tell someone, but the words wouldn't come. He knew they wouldn't believe him, just like they hadn't believed Dale Parker. But he had seen it, and he knew that thing was still out there, lurking in the fog, waiting for its next victim. The waitress refilled his cup, giving him a sympathetic smile before moving on to the next customer. Jesse stared into the black coffee, his thoughts racing. He couldn't go back out there, couldn't face that thing again. But he had no choice. This was his life, his livelihood. The road was all he knew, and no matter how hard he tried to escape, it would always pull him back. As Jesse sat there, lost in thought, he heard a low rumble outside. The ground vibrated beneath his feet, the sound growing louder, more insistent. He froze, his heart skipping a beat. It was the growl. Jesse looked up, his eyes wide with terror. The other truckers didn't seem to notice, continuing to eat and talk as if nothing was wrong. But Jesse knew better. The growl was real, and it was coming for him. He bolted out of the diner, racing toward his truck. The growl followed him, growing louder, more menacing. Jesse fumbled with the keys, his hands shaking so badly that he dropped them in the snow. He bent down to pick them up, his breath coming in ragged gasps, and that's when he saw it. The figure, standing just beyond the edge of the parking lot, shrouded in fog. Its hollow eyes were fixed on him, and the growl, oh God, the growl, was coming from its chest. Jesse didn't think. He didn't hesitate. He grabbed the keys, jumped into the truck, and gunned the engine. He tore out of the parking lot, the tires screeching on the asphalt as he sped away. He drove through the night, pushing the truck to its limits, not daring to look back. The growl followed him, a constant, relentless presence that seemed to grow louder with each passing mile. By the time the sun began to rise, Jesse was hundreds of miles away, the terror of the night fading into the light of day. But he knew it wasn't over. The figure was still out there, somewhere, waiting for him to let his guard down. He couldn't run forever. One day, it would catch up to him, just like it had caught up to Dale Parker and all the others who had crossed its path. But until that day came, Jesse would keep driving, keep moving, keep pushing forward, because stopping meant facing the darkness that lurked just beyond the edge of the road. And he wasn't ready to face it. Not yet.